As requested by many viewers, we're going to take a look back at stadiums that no longer exist. We'll check out where the teams play today and what the site has turned into. We're starting off with the stadiums demolished in the 2010s. Now, these are not all the stadiums that were demolished in this period, but there are probably over 100. And like Aristotle once said, ain't nobody got time for that. These are just the ones that seem to be the most prominent. Oh, and I will include a few that were demolished in the 2020s. Estadio Vicente Calderón, Atletico Madrid. At face value, it's just like many other stadiums in Spain, but it does have one rather unique aspect, and that is that a major public road ran underneath the main grandstand. So that's a bit of a tip for all the clubs that are confined to a small space between roads. Just build over the top of it. I'm sure the neighbours won't have any complaints. They only finished the demolition last year, so nothing has become of the site yet. Atletico Madrid now play in this wonderful stadium. Georgia Dome, Atlanta Falcons. Once again, many stadiums in the country look like this. Well, there were a lot more then than there are today. The ceiling actually looks kinda cool, which usually isn't the case with fabric roofs like this. It was an alright stadium and they could have kept playing there. Get rid of that roof and it would look like a typical NFL stadium. Only in America would a stadium of this stature have a lifespan of just 25 years. But you can understand why it was demolished when this was the other option. Anything but a typical stadium. Oh, and the Georgia Dome is now the Home Depot backyard. White Hart Lane, Tottenham Hotspur. A somewhat similar situation here, although White Hart Lane was much older than the Georgia Dome, nearly 5 times as old. Although it still had the makings of a typical English football stadium, it did however have its own unique charm. The video boards incorporated into the roof canopies were pretty cool, and I like that one side had a very modern facade whereas the other had a very old-fashioned brick facade. It comes as no surprise that many were outraged at the thought of demolishing White Hart Lane, but the replacement might be the best stadium in Europe. It was actually built, well, you can see for yourself, it envelops White Hart Lane. Rosunda Stadion, Swedish national football team and AIK. Another old school design with plenty of character, particularly this interesting looking stand. It had even hosted a World Cup final in both the men's and women's tournaments. The first stadium to ever do that. But for Sweden's national stadium in the 21st century, it just didn't cut the mustard. Which says a lot, even the bluntest of knives can cut mustard. Or can they? Maybe they're just moving the mustard. Who cuts mustard? Anyway, both teams now play at the nearby Friends Arena, which has a retractable roof that comes in handy in Sweden. This row of buildings that were attached to the stadium are still there. There are now actually some more apartment and office buildings on the site. Jack be nimble, Jack be forget it. Candlestick Park. San Francisco Giants, San Francisco 49ers. This one's interesting. It started out as a baseball-specific stadium which was the home of the Giants. But then in 1970 they just decided that it would become a multi-purpose stadium and host the 49ers as well, giving it this unorthodox look. The 49ers outlasted the Giants and actually had a longer stay at the stadium in the end. It was known for being cold and windy, which affects baseball more than football, so that's probably why the Giants were keen to move. They play here now, and the 49ers play here, which is actually in Santa Clara. The site is yet to be developed. Oh, and I should mention that the Beatles held their last ever proper concert here. They played a few good tracks as well. Paperback Writer, Nowhere Man. Lancaster Park, Crusaders, All Blacks, Black Caps, etc. This stadium has a bit of a sad story to it. It was demolished due to damage caused by the 2011 Christchurch earthquakes. No, it didn't cause the whole stadium to collapse, but it caused irreparable damage to the structure. So it was demolished several years later, actually nearly a decade later. Ironically, the naming rights were held by an insurance company, as one commenter pointed out. Oh, hang on a second. There we are. My bad. Much like Upton Park, another rugby stadium, it actually hosted cricket despite the field's small size. So the batsmen in particular would have been rather disappointed. Cricket moved here, very picturesque, and rugby moved here, less so. It will be turned into a green space with sports fields, and the stadium's memorial gates will be left as they are. Sydney Football Stadium. The ground's major tenants were the Sydney Roosters, Sydney FC and the Waratahs. The design was somewhat unique in Australia, with that wraparound roof canopy that swoops down at each end. And it too was sponsored by an insurance company, Allianz. But the owner typically doesn't get a payout if they were the ones who destroyed it. It was in need of a renovation, but despite its fairly young age, it was decided that a new stadium would be built on the same site instead. Hubert H. Humphrey Metrodome. I like that name. Would have been better if it was a hippodrome. In case you were wondering what the H stands for, it's Horatio. Its outward appearance is not too dissimilar to the Georgia Dome, but it was actually used for not just the Vikings of the NFL, but the Twins of Major League Baseball as well, and even the Golden Gophers of college football. The stadium made use of retractable seating to accommodate both sports. The interior kinda reminds me of the Tokyo Dome actually. The Twins now play at Target Field and the Vikings play at US Bank Stadium, which was built at the same site. San Diego Stadium. Much like the last one, it hosted an NFL, MLB and college football team, in the form of the Chargers, Padres and Aztecs. Stadiums from this era usually aren't very pretty, with their bare concrete exteriors, and it doesn't help that they were often multi-purpose stadiums. But having said that, there are quite a few that looked a whole lot worse than this. Instead of retractable seating, it made use of the less sophisticated but equally effective portable seating. The Padres moved here, the Chargers abandoned the city altogether, and the Aztecs are building their own new stadium. Hopefully the Spanish don't come along and conquer them again. Subiaco Oval, West Coast Eagles and the Fremantle Dockers. The Subi was the home of footy in Western Australia, but due to the fact that its future was in doubt for such a long time, in the later years no money was put into updating it. I remember watching games at the ground on TV and it just looked a little run down. The perimeter fence looked a bit ramshackle, there were still some wooden benches and like everything in Perth, it was covered in a fine layer of red dust, Perth being fairly close to the desert. But at least it had a bit of character. Both teams moved to this stunning stadium, which unlike Subiaco is also used for cricket. Today it's a rudimentary oval with a small section of seating. Oh, and they did keep these old gates from the stadium which are heritage listed. Much like Lancaster Park. Giants Stadium, New York Giants and New York Jets, oddly enough, who both moved out of stadiums that were shared with the baseball team. It has hosted more NFL games than any other stadium, obviously due to the fact that two teams played here. The new home of both teams was built right next door, and at one point both stadiums were standing simultaneously. Just like how the new Yankee Stadium is similar to the old one, Giants Stadium did look like a simpler, less flashy, less streamlined MetLife Stadium. Both are symmetrical, uncovered stadiums with 3 tiers of seating. It goes without saying, but the site is now a parking lot. Ferencváros Stadium, Hungarian national football team. It was initially built with a capacity of over 100,000, although back in those days that wasn't uncommon, due to the prevalence of standing room meaning you could squeeze in more spectators. And I'm sure they regularly packed the stadium out back then, because the 1950s was a golden age for Hungarian football. They were the best in the world. As seats were added, the stadium's capacity reduced dramatically. Also, a national football stadium with a track around the field isn't a good look. So, an incredible new stadium was built on the same site, and it too was named in honour of the late Ferenc Puskás, a former Hungarian captain. Pontiac Silverdome. It wasn't sponsored by the car company, but it was in the same city that the car company was created. Once again, it looks like a couple we've seen already, but it was actually the first major stadium that used this fabric roof style that was supported by pressurized air. It did become somewhat common, but most stadiums that had that style of roof have either replaced it or have been demolished. The stadium actually first closed way back in 2006, then reopened in 2010. The same year Pontiac the car brand ceased operations. But then the stadium closed again in 2013 after snow damaged the roof, before it was finally demolished in 2017. The Lions moved to Ford Field and the site has actually been turned into an Amazon warehouse. Tel Nepole, Slovakia national football team and Slovan Bratislava. It opened in the midst of World War II under Nazi occupation. It had an interesting design with those asymmetrical curved stands at each end, and some design elements that were added post-World War II, which were indicative of the country's communist past, such as the exterior of the main stand. It was replaced with this stadium built on the same site, by far the most advanced stadium in the country's history. It also kept the name Tel Nepole, which means brick field, although I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. Football Park, a very similar story with Subiaco Oval. Except the stadium was nowhere near as old. It was purpose-built as the home of football in the state, whereas Subiaco sort of grew into that role. But it also has a rather similar design. Oh, and by the way, I'm talking about Australian rules football. Although it seems like a nice spot near the beach, it's a bit of a trek from the centre of Adelaide. So both teams moved into the redeveloped Adelaide Oval, the home of South Australian cricket, which is just a stone's throw from the city centre. And it might be my favourite stadium in the country, just don't tell the Adelaide people that. Oh, and the site is now the training ground for the Adelaide Crows. Upton Park, West Ham United. This one was very controversial. West Ham, one of the many professional clubs in London, had been at the ground for over 100 years. It was a nice ground as well. I often mention stadiums having a castle-like exterior, and it doesn't get much more castle-like than that. It's not a random addition, but it actually ties into the club's history. I won't go into it though. As for the stadium's history, well, I don't know, let's see, has England ever played here? Oh yes, I have. It was a friendly, but I wonder... Oh, wow. Interesting. To the disdain of many football fans, they moved to London Stadium, which had hosted the 2012 Olympics, and the site is now mostly made up of housing. And that's it for today's video. Yes, I know there are more, but I think I've covered the main stadiums that were demolished in this period. If not, please feel free to let me know in the comments. And please consider subscribing if you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, have a good one.